You're folding laundry, and somewhere between the socks and the pillowcases, you've just delivered the exact sentence that would have ended an argument 3 years ago. Perfect tone, perfect timing, finally landing. Most people call this daydreaming and leave it there. It's usually something far more specific than that, and understanding what it's actually doing might change how you feel about doing it. Back in the real room, you look down and realize you've been holding the same towel, half folded, for about a minute and a half. If that made you glance around like someone might have caught you mid-scene, you're not imagining something rare. Here's the part almost nobody explains well. Your brain isn't wasting time when it does this. It's finishing something reality left open. Real life has one frustrating rule. It only gives you one take. Someone says something sharp in a meeting, and the perfect response doesn't arrive until you're rinsing a mug that night. The moment's over. The line never got said, but somewhere in your head, it's still going. Psychologists have a name for this kind of mental replay. Counterfactual thinking, your mind building the version of events that didn't happen. What if I'd said that instead? What if I'd taken the other job 3 years ago? It sounds like wasted energy. Mostly, it's your brain trying to extract a lesson from a scene that ended before it felt finished. There's a reason it doesn't just fade once the moment passes, and it isn't that you're dwelling on purpose. Psychologists call this the Zeigarnik effect, the finding that unfinished things stick in memory harder than finished ones do. An open conversation, a question nobody answered, a decision you never got closure on. These tend to stay active in your mind far longer than something that got wrapped up cleanly. That's not a flaw. It's closer to your brain refusing to file something away until it feels resolved. The same instinct that keeps a half-finished to-do list nagging at you louder than the tasks you already checked off. For most people, this stays a normal, even useful habit of mind. Something that shows up in the shower or on a long drive home and quietly does its job without ever taking over anything important. For a smaller group, it goes further than that. A psychologist named Eli Summer at the University of Haifa spent years studying people for whom this kind of inner world became the main event rather than a side one. And in 2002, he gave it a name, maladaptive daydreaming. Not because imagining is the problem, but because for some people, the inner version starts to feel more rewarding than stepping back into the real one. You don't need a clinical term to recognize the milder, everyday version of this, though. Most people who do this aren't disappearing for hours. They're doing it in 3-minute bursts, at red lights, in the shower, folding laundry, and the mechanism underneath is the same one, just running at a lower volume. An unanswered text does this constantly. The silence is not always the whole problem. It's that silence gives your mind nothing to work with, so it fills the blank on its own. The person who left you on read finally explains themselves. The apology arrives. The conversation gets the ending real life never gave it. If you've caught yourself finishing a conversation that never actually happened, out loud in an empty room, or just behind your eyes while someone else talks to you, drop the word replay in the comments. No need to explain which one, or who it was about. Not every version of this comes from something painful. Sometimes it's not a wound being replayed. It's a want. You picture having more money, and it's rarely about the number itself. It's about the version of you who doesn't flinch at an unexpected bill, who can say no to a job that isn't worth it without doing math first. You picture a different career entirely, not a better title, just work that actually feels like yours, the kind that would sound strange trying to explain to people who've only known you doing what you currently do. Maybe it's smaller than a whole career change. Maybe it's just picturing yourself walking into a crowded room and not scanning it first for who might judge you, or finally being the one who speaks first in a group instead of quietly waiting to be asked what you actually think. In that imagined version, you skip the part that actually scares you. You're already good at it. Nobody's asking if you're sure. You never have to sit there at midnight with a spreadsheet trying to figure out if the dream can cover rent, or sit through the awkward beginner phase where you're visibly bad at the thing before you're allowed to be good at it. Psychology has a term for this too, a possible self, a version of you your mind can picture clearly enough to almost step into. It isn't always wishful thinking dressed up as insight. Sometimes it's the clearest map you have of a direction you haven't let yourself walk toward yet in daylight. This is also why these scenes show up right before something real. A hard conversation with a parent, a performance review, a first date you've been putting off thinking about. You run it once, then again with a slightly better line. Then once more, because apparently some part of you does unpaid rehearsal work whether you asked for it or not. That's not automatically a problem. A lot of the time, it's useful. You walk into the real conversation having already touched the hard part once. The surprise gets smaller. You find one sentence, not a perfect one, just usable, and it's often the sentence you actually needed. If this is putting language to something you do more than you'd ever admit to another person, hit like before moving on. It helps this reach the people quietly running the same movie you are, most of them convinced they're the only one doing it. Here's where it gets complicated, and this is the part worth sitting with. The line between rehearsing something and replacing it is thinner than it feels from inside your own head. Try asking one honest question about whatever scene you keep returning to. Is this preparing me for something, or is it protecting me from actually doing it? Preparation looks like this. You imagine saying no to a request that's been draining you, and the next day, you actually say it. The scene was practice, and it worked. You rehearsed a hard conversation with your father, and a week later you had it. Slightly clumsy, still real. You pictured yourself asking a genuine question in the meeting instead of nodding along, and the next time it came up, you actually asked it. Protection looks almost identical from the outside, and that's exactly why it's easy to miss. You imagine winning the argument, but the real one never happens. You just go quiet again, same as always. You imagine finally telling someone how you feel, but the message stays unsent, saved as a draft that's been sitting there for 4 months. You picture handing in your resignation with real conviction, watching their face change, and then Monday comes around and you're back at your usual desk, having already quietly lived the satisfying version in your head sometime over the weekend. In your head, it already happened. That's precisely why some part of you no longer feels the pull to make it happen for real. One thing that actually helps is getting the scene out of your head and onto paper, even messily. Writing down the version you keep replaying does something the replaying itself doesn't. It gives your brain a signal that the information's been captured, and it can stop running the same loop looking for somewhere to put it. You don't need to write the whole scene, dialogue and all. Even a single line. I keep imagining telling him I'm done being the one who apologizes first, does more work than another silent replay ever will. Give yourself a container for it too. Some people set an actual timer, 10 honest minutes to let the scene play out fully, dramatic if it wants to be, before standing up and going back to whatever they were doing. Not because imagination is dangerous, because a rehearsal room stops helping the moment you move into it and never come back out. And if you ever catch yourself 30 minutes deep in a scene, heart actually racing over something that never once happened, the fastest way out usually isn't arguing with your own thoughts about it. It's your body. Feel your feet flat on the floor right now. Notice one real object somewhere in the room, its actual color, its edges. That small shift back into your senses tends to work faster than trying to think your way out of a thought that's already running. If you know someone who often seems lost in their own thoughts, send them this video. They'll probably recognize themselves faster than you'd expect and might not say much about it, which is usually how you'll know it landed. So if you do this more than you'd ever admit out loud, that's not a character flaw you need to fix by force. It usually means some part of your life has been asking for something reality hasn't handed you yet. Respect, closure, courage, a version of control the actual week hasn't offered, and your mind found a way to hand you a version of it anyway. That's worth taking seriously, not as a diagnosis of something wrong with you, just as useful information about where your attention's been going. The scenes you keep returning to aren't random or meaningless. Nobody accidentally rehearses the same argument 40 separate times, or keeps designing the same successful version of a life they supposedly don't care about at all. Whatever keeps showing up, uninvited, at red lights and in the shower, is usually pointing at something real that hasn't found its way into your actual days yet. The goal was never to stop imagining entirely. Nobody's asking you to live a smaller inner life, and there's nothing broken about a mind detailed enough to build entire conversations you haven't had yet. The goal is figuring out what the scene keeps trying to give you, and then bringing one honest piece of that into the actual day you're living, instead of only ever collecting it somewhere private. You don't need to become fearless by tomorrow. Nobody manages that, and it wouldn't even be the point. You just need one small, real move in the direction the fantasy's been pointing at. Send the message you've rehearsed 40 times, even if it comes out clumsier than the version in your head. Say the true sentence out loud instead of just to the version of them that only exists behind your eyes. Apply for the thing you've already imagined yourself succeeding at a dozen times. Real life won't hand you the perfect lighting or the perfect comeback right on cue, the way it always does in the version behind your eyes. It'll be messier than that version, probably a little less articulate, and definitely a lot less controllable. But it's the only version that can actually change anything about the week you're actually living. And that's worth more than getting the line exactly right. If this helped you understand where your own mind's been quietly taking you, subscribe. There's more like this coming. For anyone who's ever needed to hear that the version in their head wasn't a problem to fix, just a place that's been waiting patiently for them to visit it a little less often and live a little more right here instead.